Yali Madad. My name is Albina Bhimani, and I will be the moderator for today's Critical Conversation. The Critical Conversation series has been conceived as an ITREB USA initiative aimed at engaging the entire Jamaat, but with a focus on 18 to 40-year-olds. The series aims to explore the critical questions of our time within the context of our faith. Before we begin, in the spirit of social justice, land acknowledgement, and recognizing the history and exploitation of Indigenous peoples, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that we are all speaking from the ancestral lands of the Cherokee and Muscogee tribes in the Atlanta area. Each of us on this call today are speaking from the territories of various Indigenous peoples and tribes, some treatied and some unceded. We believe the work we do in sessions like these are part of our ongoing responsibility to acknowledge the ongoing harm that is done to Indigenous peoples on these lands, and working towards a society that is more just, equitable, and in keeping with our ethics as Ismaili Muslims. Today, we are talking about social justice in Islam, mental health, and trauma. Today's session will provide an opportunity for us to explore the multiple dimensions of mental health, trauma, and intersectionality, how trauma exists in our lives, particularly as we live in the new COVID world, as well as historical traumas that we may carry into our present, and how we might be contributing to others' trauma, and how our trauma may impede our work in social justice. During this session, you will also see a Q&A box through which you can share additional questions or thoughts during the presentation. We will try to address as many questions submitted during today's talk as we can. With that, let me introduce to you our wonderful panelists. Gulnar Feerasta, a world traveler. Al-Waiza Gulnar Feerasta has lived and studied in several different countries, including New Zealand, Australia, and South Korea. Gulnar previously worked in the corporate sector in organizational development and as a management consultant. Possessing a deep-seated passion for issues of social justice and equality, Gulnar chose to leave the for-profit world to complete higher education, which would equip her with the skills to pursue a career path more in line with her personal interests. In 2016, she received a dual master's degrees from Case Western Reserve University in Applied Social Sciences with a focus on community practice for social change and nonprofit management. She is currently the Director of Programs for the LGBT Community Center of Greater Cleveland. As a nonprofit practitioner, social justice advocate, and community activist, Gulnar has served as a strategic management consultant to international NGOs, implemented federally funded housing programs, developed and implemented culturally appropriate wraparound case management models in the LGBTQ+ community, worked with Summit County Job and Family Services in their youth education and employment initiatives, and was an independent consultant with the Louisiana Department of Education to facilitate the implementation of their redesigned education quality standards and evaluation model. Gulnar is passionate about promoting empowerment and resiliency in the LGBTQ+ community and marginalized communities through advocacy, outreach, building strong support systems, and ultimately improving quality of life through long-term policy and social change. Our second panelist for the day is Noreen Valani. Al-Waiza Noreen Valani is a licensed clinical social worker. She is currently the Managing Supervisor of Clinician Development at Headway Emotional Health Services, a community mental health clinic. As a psychotherapist, Noreen specializes in working with those impacted by trauma, addictions, and those with chronic mental health diagnoses. Her clinical competencies include DBT, sand tray therapy, EMDR, and AirNet, a modality that helps work with those who have dissociative abilities. In addition to providing therapy and clinical supervision, Noreen oversees the clinical development of both mental health clinicians and those who provide clinical supervision for mental health clinicians. My goal is to help clinicians incorporate authenticity in their work of walking with clients in their journeys of transformation, she says. As an Alwiza, Noreen focuses on helping people connect with their faith as a way to navigate the inevitable struggles that life presents. As for her faith provides meaning and reminds us that we are more than just a material body. Our final panelist for the day is Salima Versi. Alwiza Salima Versi is a PhD candidate and instructor in the University of Alberta's Religious Studies program. In addition, Salima is a psychotherapist and a Canadian certified counselor with a master's degree in counseling psychology. She has her own practice, Rehma Counseling and Consulting, where she specializes spiritual care and trauma, especially with Muslim women and women of color, cross-cultural and interfaith counseling, and feminist work, including postpartum care. She also has a strong background in parenting, and she is a certified parent educator in the STEP, Systematic Training in Effective Parenting method, which focuses on respectful, positive parenting techniques. Salima is also a career counselor for the Education Board, a live your live your life to the full facilitator with the Health Board, and remains actively engaged in mental health activism. At the outset, we would like to note that the views of our speakers expressed during the course of this discussion are their own. Let's then turn to our conversation. Thank you so much, Noreen, Gulnar, and Salima for joining us today. So the title of this session is Social Justice in Islam and Mental Health. Can you break down what this title means? How is it connected? What is mental health? Who has mental health? And how is social justice embedded in Islam? I'd like to go ahead and start us off with Salima, and Noreen and Gulnar can chime in as soon as she's done.
That's a big question. Okay, so I think it's really helpful to start with just like mental health, because one of the things I really noticed while we were even preparing for this session is that I think there's just like a lot of misunderstanding about what the term even means. So for starters, everybody has mental health. It's just like your physical health. It's a part of our broad overall well-being, right? And like our physical health, it exists on a spectrum. So just like, let's say you can have a chronic illness, like I have asthma, I've had it since I was a kid, but my asthma is pretty managed. So, you know, it doesn't always affect my overall well-being, but it does mean that I'm somewhere on a spectrum of what it means to be physically well in my body, and that I might have flare-ups and that might affect how my body is feeling. Mental health works in very similar ways, where you can have chronic illness over time that might be managed, but you can also have acute issues at specific moments in time that affect your mental health. And we call those things mental illnesses the way that we deal with physical illnesses like asthma. And so I just think that's really helpful, because often when we say, you know, we're talking about mental health, we assume that we're talking about only mental illness. And I think for this talk in particular, while we are talking about the places where our mental health maybe suffers because other things have happened, we're also talking about the ways in which particular instances or overall injustice can affect all of us in our mental well-being in a broad way, even if it's not resulting in a clear clinical mental illness, right? So a really broad, open-ended understanding of mental health that is actually much more in line with how we think about mental health historically in Islam. So if you look at something like the ethic of sound mind that's come up in a lot of our discussions as we were preparing for this, it looks at this idea that like sound mind in a broad sense is part of how we think about what it means to be a human in the world. And something that we value, that we want to ensure that folks have an ability to work towards a soundness of mind, even though that might vary from person to person and place to place. And so that's kind of the broad starting point in terms of mental health. And then I'll just really briefly talk about the social justice piece, because I think it's related here, and I'll let someone else pick up the trauma piece. So I think the other thing that often comes up is my specialization is a lot of the intersections between mental health, Islam, and social justice. That's kind of where I work. And I often hear people tell me that like this idea of mental health and mental illness comes from outside of our tradition. Like this is like this thing that we came up with after we migrated westward. And it always surprises people to know that the first mental health hospital that we have on record in the world was built by Muslims in Baghdad in 705. We have a long-standing tradition of recognizing mental health as part of our broad approach to well-being in Islam, and that includes psychological wellness, physical wellness, spiritual wellness, and social wellness, right? That we're interconnected in these ways, and that all those pieces play together. So when you look at the early Muslim work on what we would now call psychology, which they called ilm al-nafs, you're looking at folks who saw broad bases for how we are well in the world and where those things might be kind of getting interrupted. And a lot of the treatment models, yes, had sort of medical, physical basis, but also had a lot of social components. Like if someone was homeless or someone wasn't eating well or someone wasn't able to be active in their lives in the ways that they wanted to, that would, of course, impact how they were feeling. And then they would show up in these various care settings. And so the physicians and the workers at the time, and our philosophers really, focused on these broad things. And so when we think about social justice, those are the things we're talking about. We're talking about all of these areas that impact our well-being, right? So what are the structures that we live in that might get in the way of our being really fully ourselves, being authentic in our wholeness, being able to access ourselves in full, spiritually, mentally, physically, right? And that's where social justice really comes in. And it's a deeply Islamic concept. This idea that we're working towards a vision of the world that Allah has told us is about equity and justice and space for all of us to really arrive in our fullness. That's at the heart of the message of Islam. And so I think that's a really important starting point. And I think I'll let someone else pick up on maybe the trauma piece because I didn't cover that.
Well, I'm wondering if Gulnar, you might want to share a little bit about kind of that social justice component as well. I know that you have some really good framework to help us understand how we as Muslims are called to have an integrated life and not one that's siloed.
Yeah, so I think that that's a really good segue into thinking about how do we live a life of spiritual coherence, right? Because we don't live life in a silo. So all the things that Salima was just talking about, these what we would call external factors, right? Housing, a socioeconomic status, even just our just the things that would be personal characteristics, race, gender, orientation, all of those things do impact the way that we interact with the world. And, you know, a term for that is intersectionality. And so when we think about that, you know, it's about how all these different characteristics or identities sort of intersect with one another, overlap with one another. And so instead of what's happened is that we've now moved to this idea of mental health and trauma being more of a personal issue, that people are flawed. But when we think about it in terms of social justice, it's really thinking about access and equity. How do we look at it in terms of all of these social factors impacting people in the way that they navigate them, creating access to that. And so when we are thinking about it in terms of social justice, we have to look at how, you know, the example that Salima gave about homelessness. So when somebody is homeless, there's a whole myriad of factors that also affects their mental health and their mental well-being, and that's what makes it social justice, because we're not living in a vacuum. We're not living in a silo around, okay, my mental health is different, my personal wellness is different, and then my homelessness issue is different. They all are interconnected, and that's what impacts like a person's holistic wellness. um, and so that's how we've got to look at it as more than just being sort of parsed out in these individual buckets.
Yeah, I really appreciate that a lot. And I think that it's really important to think about the different factors that are contributing to someone's mental well-being and physical well-being, and how these things are interconnected. Let's move towards this trauma piece that Salima mentioned earlier that I think I would love to hear Noreen's thoughts on. So could you help us understand what trauma is, why and how does trauma happen in our lives, and how does it manifest?
So one of the things that kind of both Salima and Gulnar really speak to is this idea that mental health is part of being human. And I think that one of the things to keep remembering is that we are human and we respond in human ways. And so there is this idea of pathology is really a modern concept. And it comes from this idea that something's wrong and we need to fix it. And so when we look at trauma, we have to look at it as we are responding to a situation. And so there are lots of different kinds of experiences that we have. When we talk about trauma, what I want to use is this definition called the assumptive model, or the assumptive world model. And it's this idea that in order for us to proceed through the world, we have certain core beliefs, and those beliefs allow us to make decisions. And so one of the reasons I can get up in the morning is because, and send my kid to school, is because I believe that the world is safe to a certain degree, that I believe that there is some measure of control I have. And each one of us may have our own statements that we have inside of our head, but roughly speaking, what we see is that they fall into about three major categories. The first is this idea that I have worth, I have value. The second is that the world is benevolent, or it's safe, there's safety out there. And then the other thing is this notion of kind of like justice, or that we have power in the world, that we're able to do things. And if any of those beliefs get impacted, what we find ourselves is spinning. And we spin until we're able to recreate meaning. So right now, in the time of COVID, one of the things I think about is before sending my kid to school was a no-brainer. You know, I believed in the system. I believed that the kids would do better in school. We were excited about sending them to school. Now it's not as exciting. In fact, it's a large debate. And it's trying to figure out, okay, can I send them? Can I not send them? And I know that a lot of parents and a lot of students themselves and a lot of people in their professions, we're asking ourselves, can we go to work? Can we go to school? Can we send our loved ones out the door? This is an example of kind of like a global trauma. And all of us are going to respond to it because those beliefs that we had have been shaken. And now each one of us is going to have to come to a way to navigate that uncertainty. And that's kind of creating meaning. Mm-hmm. And so one of the ways that I understand and talk about trauma is that trauma isn't anything wrong with us. Trauma is a natural human response that we have to a situation and how it impacts our beliefs about ourselves or about the world. The other thing that I like to talk a little bit is about the biological aspects of trauma. One of the things is that we have been created in a way that we are adaptive, and we have a lot of adaptations and resiliency. And those things are gifts that are given to us. And so I often joke about if you have a gazelle who's completely nonchalant and super happy going to the watering hole, frolicking and going la 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 and not paying attention, the chances are the gazelle's not going to be aware of the threats. And so we have all been given this ability of a security system, for lack of a better word, that we're able to look around and scan our environment and determine, hey, are we safe or not? That question. And that allows us to navigate our environment. And so for me, when you talk about trauma, it's really important to talk about resiliency and adaptive capacity for each of us. When we're put in situations, we adapt. And in those situations, those adaptive strategies are effective. And so they should be praised and they should be valued. What happens is that when that situation changes, we find ourselves still utilizing those strategies and they're no longer helpful to us. And there's a story that someone shared with me, and I use this story because it really illustrates it. And it talks about a person who's thrown in the river and they're swirling around and they can't get to the surface. And all of a sudden they find a log and they grab onto the log and hold onto it as tight as they can. And that log saves their life. It helps keep them afloat because the log has the natural properties to stay, have buoyancy. You're holding onto it. And somehow the person is able to get to the shore. They take a deep breath and then they say, okay, now I have to go through this forest to get to where I need to get to safety. And so they pick up the log because they know the log saved them and start dragging it with them through the forest. And that's what adaptation sometimes looks like. In the river, the log was crucial and essential. And now in the forest, grabbing a log and dragging it with them isn't going to be as helpful or adaptive. And so part of the work is recognizing that, hey, I have this tool that worked for me in this context, but I no longer need this tool. I need a different tool. And so when we talk about trauma, the focus isn't about what's wrong or what's broken. It's about our ability to adapt, our biological mechanisms to keep us safe. I know many people have talked about fight, flight, and freeze. There are nuances to it, but I'm going to keep it pretty basic for today. It's this idea that when we face a threat, our physiological responses, and there's hormonal, and we can talk a lot about the different neurochemicals that happen, but in short, our bodies operate to help us get away, and it gives us the energy. That's why when you talk about adrenaline and you see mothers like lift cars off their babies, it's these acts which normally couldn't, but what it does is that the body bypasses its kind of normal parameters, sometimes to the expense of the body, to be able to do these really great acts. And so fight allows us to know, hey, I'm in danger, I can fight back. But then flight also says, hey, I might not be able to. This threat that I'm facing is going to be too large for me, and so I'm going to run. And then the other one is freeze. And freeze often happens when you recognize I can't fight, but I can't get away. And so what I'm going to do is find a way to almost, the word is dissociate. You move outside. And so what it does is it minimizes the discomfort that you're in so that you're able to survive it. And each one of these is a great gift that humans get in order to adapt and to survive. Where we have to really remind ourselves to be careful is when we start to say that's a problem. Because it's not a problem, it's just that it's no longer working.
Yeah, I really appreciate this distinction that you've brought up and this notion of context and how we adapt to the changing context of our time, because even our context doesn't stay stagnant, right? It continues to evolve and change. And so how does the body and the mind then adapt to these changes that we're facing? Thank you so much. I think this really nicely leads into this notion of intersectionality that we brought up in the very beginning of our conversation. And I'd love to hear more about this. So we've heard a lot about the term intersectionality, and Gulnar did a wonderful job of giving us a little bit of a snapshot of it. But what is intersectionality in its whole? What does it mean? And how does it impact mental health and trauma? And I would love it if Gulnar could get us started with this.
Sure. So intersectionality is basically the idea about how class, race, gender, and other individual characteristics intersect with one another and overlap, and how that plays out in how we as individuals navigate the world, right? And so in this case, when we're talking about trauma and mental health, I want to sort of piggyback off what Noreen said around, where the problem occurs is when we look at people and we say that, okay, how you're dealing with your trauma or how you're dealing with your mental health is problematic, and it becomes like a person problem. And we start looking at the person as flawed instead of looking at stepping back and saying, okay, it's not the person that's flawed, it's the situation that is problematic, or the larger system that's problematic. And so I always want to remind people that, the response from the person, they are coping the best way they can in the best way they know how, given their skills, their abilities, their capacity. And so what they are having is an absolutely normal reaction to an abnormal situation. And I'm going to say it again, an absolutely normal reaction to an abnormal situation, because it is generally the situation that is problematic, or it's always the external things that are creating this trauma, or you know, there's the causation, right, that is causing these mental issues to manifest. And so you know, going back to that idea of pathologizing people, that's where this you know, intersectionality becomes really important, because what we need to do is we need to have a more political and intersectional analysis that looks at, okay, how do these systems affect the way that you know, we are propagating oppression and trauma, you know, and race, gender, socioeconomic status. All of these things have huge implications for health outcomes, including mental health. So, for example, you know, people of color who experience mental illness or disability, or are struggling with addiction, they're more likely to experience what we would call coercive or forced interventions than their white counterparts. Like, so they're more likely to be forced into a drug intervention program, or usually they end up in jail, right? And that is, you know, another form of police violence, mass incarceration, being committed into maybe a psychiatric ward. Like, people's choices are taken away from them. Then they're, you know, if they're younger and they're in school, you know, juvenile expulsion, which then feeds into the school to prison pipeline. And so ultimately mental health and trauma, the propagation of trauma through these interventions and through these systems of oppression, these are all social justice issues. They're civil rights issues. And so, you know, tying it back to what Salima was talking about around these social determinants, you know, access to housing, education, economic stability, social support. I mean, there's enormous discrepancies between different communities of color, and different minority communities. And then if you take it one level down and you look at marginalized populations within different communities, then there's a whole different level of disparity. And so a social justice approach to mental health and trauma would help us to focus on ensuring there's equitable access to the, you know, so we would be looking at improving the social determinants of health for everyone, because it's impossible to regain your health, both physical and mental, if your basic needs are going unmet, right? And so that's where all of this sort of ties in together when we think about it from that social justice lens.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this reminds me a little bit about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and how the most basic of elements, if those aren't even met, then how do we begin to even consider some of these other higher level needs that we may have? And so thank you so much for sharing that. I think that definitely made a lot of sense. So now that we're beginning to understand trauma and the roots of trauma, how does this trauma manifest in our own community? What are the ways that we may perpetuate trauma? And this is also, I think, something that is reflected as in the Q&A box. So I think they're really interested in seeing how does that affect us in our community and how we may be perpetuating that. So can I start with Salima on this, if that's okay?
Yeah, I agree. I think a lot of the comments and Q&As are showing exactly where those fault lines are. And I think that's pretty telling. So obviously at all of our intersection points, where our identities overlap, where we're sort of, that's where rubber meets the road on this, right? So within the community, the place where we find experiences that are traumatic for folks, experiences that where people are experiencing harm in various ways that is affecting their ability to make meaning, often happens at those intersection points of okay, so for me, you know, like, what does it mean to be a woman of color and a Muslim and an Ismaili and a mother, and you know what I mean, all these ands. And those things, when they kind of come at a head, even in my work in the Jamaat, those are usually the points where I struggle, right? Where I potentially am experiencing discrimination in particular kinds of ways, or where maybe there isn't as much space made and held for me as I need to feel safe, and to feel like my community supports me. And so I think that that's really something that we need to think about, and I think really what this session was inherently about. The other thing that I'm also really particularly interested in is our history of trauma as a community and how that affects our ability to actually engage in conversations around trauma now. So if I have experienced trauma and it's unprocessed, I'm not at a place where I'm able to acknowledge the feelings of loss or grief or anger or confusion or all of these things that come out of trauma for me, it will be very difficult for me to respond empathetically to someone else who is experiencing those feelings. So, basic example that we've been dealing with, I think all of us as panelists in the sort of recent months especially, is if we talk about anti-Blackness in our community, okay? I come personally from Koja East African roots, okay? My parents are both from East Africa. They migrated to Canada in the 70s, and that's the rooting that I have in the community. And so my parents, but especially my grandparents' sense of what Blackness is very conditioned by their experience in East Africa. It's only one side of the story, but it was their experience. This sense of having lost what they built, a sense of being forced out of a place that you thought of as home, and that is trauma, at least in the Canadian context, which is where I am, that goes largely unexpressed. It's actually the area that I research in religious studies, and a lot of times when you ask folks what that migration was like and what the Canadian experience has been like for them, they'll overwhelmingly focus on the positive things. Canada was great, Canada was really welcoming, we were able to do this and that, Imam's guidance supported us, the Imam's institutions supported us, and there's a desire to focus on sort of that positive narrative, and that can be really good. And it's a survival technique. It's a thing that helped us manage trauma, right? Like, it was the thing that helped us come here, establish ourselves, really function as a community. But now, that same narrative is getting in the way of us being able to acknowledge the ways in which anti-Blackness is affecting us as a community, right? And so we have to be able to hold those pieces simultaneously. I have to be able to say, my parents and grandparents experienced sorrow and sadness and loss and grief in their migration. And that is a real thing that I have to hold space for. And I have Black folks that I love that are part of my community, and they're currently experiencing trauma and grief and harm because of how we're responding to them. And so I think, like, our ability to hold those pieces and really, like, acknowledge our own pain helps us get better at acknowledging other people's pain. Right? And that's really, like, so my practice is called Rahma, because that's the lens I use to do the work, right? Like, this idea that, like, Allah is a source of ultimate loving compassion, and what does it mean to reflect that loving compassion to one another and to ourselves in our community in all of these ways, in the historical trauma that we carry regardless of where we come from, right? Because all of us have had to migrate westward, those of us that are here, and even those that still continue to exist in territories to which they are indigenous have experienced colonization or sort of economic collapse or warfare, all these other things that are real traumas that we carry. How do we make space for that pain that we hold? And then how do I also make space for the fact that maybe in my pain, I wasn't really hearing someone else's, right? So in Canada, one of our points of tension is between sort of established East African Khoja communities and those that have come later on. Particularly, we had a large wave from Afghanistan and Central Asia that came sort of in the 90s and early 2000s. And this sense that sometimes exists that, like, you know, Khojas sometimes feel like, oh, well, you know, we did this work and we tried and we worked hard, and so we were able to do that, and so they should do that too. And this sense of like, I went through this terrible thing and so you can too and you'll come out okay, rather than saying like, I went through this terrible thing, how do I make sure you don't have to do that? How do I make sure that your experience is better than mine was? How do I make sure that all of the lessons that I have learned because I went through pain are there to support you so you don't have to? And I think that when we don't have space for our own pain, that's what we do. We reenact it on others. And I see that a lot even in the community at our intersection points. It's pain that we carry, it's trauma that we carry that we haven't made space for, that we're not acknowledging in ourselves, and it makes it hard for us to acknowledge in others. That's part of the issue around the mental health stigma, right? Like, it's hard for us to accept, if my meaning-making framework is faith, and faith is my answer to everything, but I have this young child who's been coming to Kani with me every day, and they're still struggling with depression, that's going to interrupt my meaning-making. And I don't know how to handle that. So I tell them, it's okay, say salva. And that's not how I mean it, but we're then using it as a way, it's a spiritual bypassing, a way of using faith to get around our own feelings of pain or discomfort, or the ways in which our own meaning making might be rupturing. So yeah, like, it shows up in our community in a lot of ways, but I also think when we sit with it a little bit, it shows us the pathways to change too. Because those places of pain are also our spaces to open and grow.
One of the things that I love, Salima, that you talk about is kind of what are the ways that we participate in maybe hurting others without realizing it. One of the things we've talked, the three of us, is how we want to really focus on really value and respect intent and honor the fact that our intent is good, but really understand impact and see how what we do impacts other people. And so one of the things and some of the questions that have come up around traumas, how do we do and support that with others? Meaning making is personal, and it's deeply personal. There might be a cultural component to it. And that also makes me really hesitant to recommend that we should go out to other communities or other countries or other cultures and tell them how they should do this work. And the reason for that is because in part, colonialism did that, right? It told us how we need to do this work and we need to follow this white value system. And it's oppressive because it's telling somebody else that here's what meaning is, here's what this is the right way of doing it. These are the truths with the absolute capital T. And what we find is that meaning making is deeply personal. How I come to terms with the loss of someone isn't going to be the way someone else comes to terms with it. And if I try to offer, even with really amazing intent, and I have that, like when I know after my mom passed away, a lot of different people would come to me and say, oh, but she's in a better place, or, shukar mola, or, she had done so much good work in this world that her job was done. And it was hard because in a way you're like grieving the loss of someone you love and care profoundly for. And it isn't somewhere that I had arrived. I hadn't come to those meanings. And so sometimes when we're helping and supporting people, if we start to give them meaning, it's actually a form of oppression. And we'll notice it because we're going to start getting convincing. We're going to be like, well, why don't you just do this? And why don't you just think about that? And when we notice that we start to lean in and we start to give a lot of advice, we need to step back and notice that we're convincing. And convincing is kind of exactly what Salima talked about. It's an attempt to deal with our own distress. And it's also an attempt to deal with our distress that someone we love and care about is experiencing distress. And so in order to bypass their distress, what we do is we try to jump ahead, and that jumping ahead actually can be very harmful and traumatic. One of the big distinctions between talking about trauma and processing trauma is exactly that. Talking about what has happened isn't healing. Processing what has happened and being able to come and arrive to meaning is. And so we do that by listening. We do that by not attributing meaning. It's not to say that that person won't come to the same understanding or realization that I had, just that that journey that they're going through is incredibly important. And so the example that I tend to give is I do a lot of work with trauma, and I work with a lot of different clients. And oftentimes as we're doing these processes, I realize that the way they've come to term with the experiences is I could have never come up with that on my own. And so even when we're talking about people who've been oppressed and who experienced racism, people who have experienced discrimination, people who have been objectified because of their gender, their orientation, and all of these things, I can't give them meaning. So one of the things about intersectionality that I've learned from Gulnar actually is that I may have a minority perspective. I am a woman, I'm a person of color, but it doesn't mean that my minority perspective allows me to speak authoritatively on someone else's. And so if I'm having a conversation with someone who is my Black brother or sister, I can't assume that my experience gives me the same understanding. And so one of the things that can happen is that when we get into these conversations and we start to speak over the person or tell them what their experiences mean, that is a form of inflicting trauma. And so I kind of like to bring that up as a lens as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, and I think that that's just so important too, is to think about, what is our role? How have we unknowingly participated in inflicting this trauma? And again, I want to, separate that from intent and think about it as intent versus impact, right? And honor the fact that all of us have good intent, because really we are responding to the very real pain that we are seeing somebody we love and care deeply about is experiencing. And so we feel like we want to do something, right? But we've got to check ourselves, because and recognize that sometimes that is coming from this desire to fix someone, and that we're trying to fix it or problem solve it, where and by doing that, we are taking away somebody's autonomy, and that is oppressive. And by doing that, that's a form of silencing. We're silencing people, and it can also be a form of erasure, because we're just dismissing them. We're saying that, you're in pain or whatever, but it doesn't really have value here, because here's the way to solve it. So whatever you're experiencing is really not a big deal, because you weren't smart enough to think of this way of solving the problem and fixing yourself, and I'm going to give it to you. And that's a form of that shows you how deeply and internally we have colonized our minds, because that comes from colonialism. And so we have to move towards thinking about, how do we decolonize our minds? And then that filters out towards more into the community of, how do we decolonize these patterns of thinking and our systems, our institutions? How do we move away from that colonial lens that we have on, and move more towards reframing more authentically from a faith-based perspective, from a communal perspective, and become more spiritually coherent and really incorporate what our faith teaches us around social justice and our responsibility to those who are most vulnerable and most oppressed and most marginalized in our communities.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think all three of you have raised a lot of important elements of how we give, to thinking about the notion of how we give space, how do we talk versus process, how do we decolonize our mind. I think these are really important elements that we need to be thinking more deeply about. And I think the next question then is one of the most important ones, is what are ways that we can do that? What are ways that we can begin to address the trauma that we see in our society and community? And then I think after that, how do we begin to address the stigma around mental health? But I think the first question is really key here, because like I said, I think you've addressed and brought to the forefront many elements that we should be thinking about. But I would really like the audience to see how they could take steps to actually begin doing that for themselves. Noreen, would you like to begin?
Well, there was a question that talked about it, so I thought maybe I'd start by kind of addressing how do we listen? And that's going to be, what's the way that we listen so that we're not inflicting and that we're actually being compassionate? And some of the things, and I did include in some of the resources that I shared, some of the articles that will also help further readings around this, as well as Salima and Gulnar have. The first step to listening to someone's story is recognizing that they're trying to make sense of it. And so the minute that when we start to step in and we try to tell them what they should think or how they should think or what they should do, if they haven't asked, right? So there's this concept of consent that I say is fundamental in any form of listening. So ask. And so if someone comes to me and says, hey, you know what, I had a really bad day. One of the hardest parts about living in this COVID world is I can't go to Jamaat Khana, and I'm really noticing that I feel distant from my faith. And that's one of the things I hear people say over and over again. And sometimes the response will be, well, why don't you just say dua at home? And I do Zoom calls with dua, and, you know, take out more tasbih. And what happens is that when we're jumping into that problem solving is that we're starting to offer solutions, and we're offering meaning, and we're offering things before the person's ready for it. And so when someone sits there and says, hey, I'm really struggling, whatever that struggle may be, the first question is to say, how can I help you? What do you need from me? Sometimes people need a hug. Sometimes people need a listening ear. And in this time, and I think another point that came up in the questions a lot is kind of, we are physically distancing, but we're not socially distancing. And so how do we connect with people when we're needing? And so how do we create that space? And we do it first by asking what they're looking for. Second, by listening. And I tend to use this metaphor of the cup. If a cup is really full, you can't add anything to it. There needs to be an opportunity for that, whatever is in that cup, to be poured out. And the process of pouring it out is going to be through validation and through that normalization. And so when someone comes to you, the first thing you do is by listening, what you do is you allow for that level of intensity to decrease. You let them be heard. That validation allows them to not get defensive, right? Because when people are hurt, they're actually activated. And so they are actually putting up walls. Like physiologically, when you are hurting and you have a trauma response, it is that fight flight response. So it is going to be a wall. And so if you try to talk to a wall, it's going to be, you're going to find yourself having to really ram it. And that's actually really, is really violent. And so one of the things that you have to do is you have to sit so that the person will let the wall down, so that they're no longer in that activated stage. And you really do that by listening and validating. I hear you, this is hard, I get it. You know? And once you start to notice that the activation, so if you start to notice that they're looking calmer, their speech is not as elevated, they're not speaking as quickly, if they're, you know, using language, their language starts to change. So they're going from where you're talking about emotional things to kind of a little bit more, here's what I think. Then you can say, hey, what would be helpful? And then they might ask you, hey, what do you do when you feel this way? Or do you feel this way? And then I might say, yeah, I do feel this way, actually. And here's what I do. You know, one of the ways that Salima speaks, if you notice, is she talks a lot about I notice this, I feel this, I'm perspective. And one of the greatest ways that we can avoid hurting others is by really making sure that we use the language of I. Because then what we do is we allow for there to be other people to exist in the same space. Because I may deal something differently than you will, and neither one is right or wrong. And so it gets away from that false dichotomy that it's right or wrong. And it really gets to that this is something that we do and we're figuring out. So that would be my suggestion. And in response to some of the questions that have also already come up.
Yeah, I would Agree, and I would build on that a little bit. So there's a couple, I'm a big fan of concrete tools. Like I like theory a lot, but as you know, like all of us work in the field, so we're also big fans of like, how do you actually do this? So there's a couple things that I just want to share that I think have been helpful for me in my practice, and in my work in the Jamaat, and just like as a human in the world. So when I was working on my graduate degree in psychology, in my clinical skills class, we had this prof, and one of the things that you do in clinical skills is like you have to practice with another student, right? So you like, one of you pretends to be the therapist, one of you pretends to be the student, and then you switch. And we had to like record it and transcribe it. It was a whole thing, right? Okay. So one of the things that our prof told us before we started these practice sessions was you are only allowed to do 3 things. You're allowed to make empathy statements, you're allowed to make reflection statements, and you can ask questions, but only to clarify factual information. Let me tell you, this is literally the hardest class I've ever done. It was brutally difficult for all of us to limit ourselves to those 3 things. Naturally, the way that we are conditioned in our societies is that we listen to respond. Right? So we listen and then we'll ask questions about like, well, have you thought of this? And you know, what about this? And like, we want to, yeah, we do the fix it. I want to fix this thing. And so to force us to do it, we were taken back down to like brass tacks basics. And so there were a couple things that I found really useful as tools to do that. So one is, yeah, try not to ask questions unless they're factual. I know that sounds super strange. You can bring them back in later, but if you get out of the habit of being like, well, what about this? And well, have you thought about, and just like actually not asking the question initially, that forces your brain into a different space, which is a really good starting point. The second is empathy. We talk about empathy a lot. I talk about empathy as like the tool through which we actually do the work of rahma. Like if we're talking about love and compassion, empathy is how I do that in the world. Empathy is me saying, I see you, I hear you, I understand what you're saying. But we're not trained to actually do that in our world right now. And so we actually have to learn this as a skill. And again, one of the things that this prof had taught us was what she called formulaic empathy, which at the time I hated. Like it was so hard. But it's been really useful because now it helps me to teach others, and it taught me how to do this like well, I think. So formulaic empathy is you feel, insert feeling here, because, insert the reason. And I know that that sounds super simple, but it's really hard in practice because we're not good at feeling words. We're not good at listening to why people feel the way they feel. We're not good at doing depth. We're not good at sitting with those feelings, right? We talked about that unprocessed stuff. And so that really basic, okay, so what I hear is that you feel hurt because when I was busy working, I wasn't making time for you. And immediately you'll see people's reactivity drop because now you've seen them. That's rahma. I see you. I hear you. I can get where you're coming from. And I'm not here to try and fix it. I'm not here to try and solve it. I'm just here, right? And so I know it seems super basic, but it's like a genuine skill we have to work at. And so I really like that. And one of the other things that's been coming up a lot in the questions is like how do I do this? And how do we encourage the Jamaat? And the other thing that I think is really a related skill to empathy is what I use is called bracketing. And it like comes from like phenomenology, and it's a whole thing, but it's actually really basic. Think about like a math equation, and you have like, 3 plus 4, and then you have plus, and you have an open bracket, and then you have an equation and you close your bracket. And when you see that in a math equation, you're like, I have to treat the things in the brackets separately. I'm going to deal with that on its own, and at the end I'll add it back into the equation. You actually have to do that with your own thoughts and feelings when you're trying to listen to someone else. So if I'm listening to Gulnar tell me about her experiences at her particular intersections, the fact that I share those intersections in some ways is not especially relevant in that moment. My job is to hold my experience in brackets so that I can fully hear hers. And then at the end, if it's useful to her, I can drop those brackets and we can talk together, or I can drop the brackets later on my own so that I can process it. But in the moment, my job is just to suspend it temporarily. And it's an essential life skill. It's actually how I start when I teach religion at the university, because you can't learn about religion if you can't bracket. You have to do this work. And it is one of the most useful skills, just like as a person in the world, particularly now when things are so contentious. Like bracketing and empathy are how we do pluralism well. You cannot engage with difference if you cannot hear and see difference, and if you're not willing to engage with difference in a way that isn't defensive, right? And when we aren't able to do that, those are the spaces that create trauma for others. So yeah, I think there are some really like tangible skills that we can use that support the work.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. I'd like to offer Gulnar a chance to speak on this as well. I know we've been taking some of the questions from the Q&A box as well, so we'll continue with those after Gulnar speaks.
Yeah, so I think that both what Noreen and Salima have offered is a really great way to think about it at an individual level. And, you know, I think those are some really great skills to kind of think about building upon and looking at how can we, on a personal level, really sort of stop and reflect. So for me, it comes down to thinking about taking a minute to sit and reflect, and it may cause some discomfort, but we have to be okay with sitting in discomfort and thinking about, okay, what has been our role or my role in this system? And I know that systems seems really big, but in reality we are all part of a system because we all belong to an ecosystem, right? And so I would offer that we should begin from a place of acceptance, because we are all flawed, right? So if we just accept that from the beginning, that can go a long way in helping to alleviate some of that discomfort. And so, we're not perfect. Perfection belongs only to Allah alone. But if we recognize that we are all flawed, then, and we accept that, then the work can truly begin. So again, back to intent versus impact. Our intent was good, but maybe how we enacted or responded to the pain and suffering of someone was not maybe the best way that we should have done that, right? By telling somebody, why don't you say as-Allah? Or, really, Hazrat Imam focuses so much on happiness, so we really should try to be happy all the time. But the Imam also recognizes and affirms that there will be times of difficulty, and there will be times where you are going to be feeling sadness. The Imam affirms that and recognizes that we are human and we are going to experience the wide breadth and range of all the human emotions, because that is part of the human experience. So instead of being dismissive or minimizing, again, you just respond by saying, I am so sorry that you're experiencing this. How can I help? What would you like from me? Just like Noreen and Salima have been talking about. So instead of doing the spiritual bypass, really sit there and say, what would you like from me? How can I support? And if the person is, is specific enough, and says like, I need help, I don't know how I should, what I need, then making sure that they get connected to the right resources or to an expert that can help them. And so this is where that social justice piece comes in, because knowing as marginalized community ourselves, and if there is somebody who is, if it's somebody who is within that subsegment that is additionally, living on the fringes or additionally marginalized because of their gender identity, their orientation, their socioeconomic status, being an advocate for them to make sure that they are able to get access to what they need, making sure that they are being treated properly in that system, right? That is where you can help. And so these are all the things that we need to kind of expand our thinking around trauma and mental health beyond just thinking of it in a silo, because we don't live in silos. We live in this wider society where we experience all of these different things all at the same time. And so if we want to think about how does this integrate together with our faith and with the secular life and the material life, our faith is very clear about that there is no dichotomy between the material and the spiritual. We must live a life of spiritual coherence, which is a term that I have to give credit to one of my friends that coined that term, Natasha. And so full credit to her for coining that term. But we have to, think about ways in which we live a life of spiritual coherence. And the Imam has done a beautiful job of laying that out for us in the AKDN framework. The ethical framework of the AKDN looks at every facet of life and and the different factors or elements that impact quality of life. And it does so from the lens of creating equity and justice for those who are most marginalized amongst us, right? Because if those who are most vulnerable amongst us are not doing well, then we are not doing well, because we are only as good as the least amongst us. And so our faith, being a faith of social justice, enjoins upon us to strive for that whenever and wherever we can. And so that doesn't mean that, okay, I live like my material life until like 5:30. Oh, it's 6 o'clock. I go say my dua. I'm going to be spiritual right now. And then at 7 o'clock, I'm going to go back to living my material life. That's not how we live our lives. We live these things together. And, I always think about the Imam's speeches and what he says to us. And it makes me think, when I think about this, I think about the Sadi poem that Imam constantly is quoting to us, where he talks about, oh, children of Adam. And he talks about, like, if one of you is suffering, then, all of you are suffering. And if you can't feel the pain of your fellow man suffering, are you worthy of being called a human? Right? And so we got to think about that. Like, if we are not able to empathize and relate to that pain in some way deeply inside our soul, then what does that say? That's a question for us to think about and reflect upon. And as we do that, we look in the Jamaat and we see these conversations happening around, classism and elitism, and what does that mean? And, we see these things around meritocracy, and when did meritocracy change into being like elitist and classist? Because that's not what meritocracy is about, right? It's about being the best that you can be. But meritocracy doesn't automatically then equal like, okay, I'm going to be as rich as I can and be as wealthy as I can. Like, it's not capitalism. Meritocracy is not capitalism. And so we're creating these like substratas and the stratification within our own community. And it goes back to colonization of our mind, because that's a very colonial way of thinking. And what is the trauma that's being inflicted on people that are being left out, right? And how are these systems and institutions and programs that we implement that very subtly create these systems of exclusion because of these things that we are creating? What is the impact? So again, the intent may be good about wanting to create access to these programs and experiences, but who is being excluded and what is the impact of that? And so we've really got to start having these conversations and focusing on that. And then, and how do we improve that? Accountability, right? how do we create systems of accountability? And so, we have to start thinking in those terms. And so that is where I would sort of want to put that out there for us to start having larger conversations around integrating these ideas and not trying to silo them out, because ultimately everything in our faith, everything that we do is about social justice. You cannot say that it's talk about Islam and being a Muslim and not think about social justice, right? Because to me, I simplify it down to this, that, if a Muslim is defined as somebody who submits to the will of God, right? So if Islam equals submission to Allah, then what does submission mean? And so submission means that we are striving to be more perfect in that submission by serving Allah's creation. So what does serving Allah's creation mean? Being stewards of his creation. As Ashraful Makhlukat, we are given great privilege. And with great privilege comes great responsibility. And so that responsibility is all about social justice. And it's not just, in terms of humans, but also environmental justice. How are we taking care of this earth? And so, so there's a lot that we are responsible for, given this great privilege of being Ashraful Makhlukat, God's greatest creation. We have to ask ourselves, are we ready to step up to that? Because that is what Allah expects of us, right? And so going back to that poem of Sadi's, if you don't feel the pain, then are you worthy of being called a human? And that's not me saying that, right? The Imam has quoted that poem. The poem is asking you that. The Quran quotes very many verses on that. So that's where I would leave it. And I mean, that's the way I think about it.
I think that was beautifully well said, and I think I and along with the audience appreciates how you've brought in components of this notion of spiritual cohesion and these elements of how are we fully present in our being, and I really appreciate that. And I think that really nicely leads to a question that we got in the chat box that I'd like Noreen and Salima to also offer their viewpoints, because I think Gulnar really nicely shared a response to this. But significant diversity exists within our Jamaat, be it race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, etc. And we find that if they don't fit an accepted normative identity, they are excluded or marginalized. So how do we begin to do the hard work to reduce the trauma inflicted? I know we've spoken a little bit about the individual, perhaps also in terms of how as a community we could do more of that work. I think that would be really appreciated as well. But yeah, Noreen or Salima, would you be willing to talk about this?
Yeah, I can go, and then I think it's different for me because I'm a Canadian. So like my institutional context is somewhat different, as I've learned over the last few weeks working with all of y'all. So, I mean, I think like often when we say we want institutional change, it means we want policy and program change, right? In our Ismaili institutions. And I think that is good and valuable and important, but I also think that those pieces reflect often what's happening on the ground too. So I feel like it's really important to do both. And so the individual piece is relevant in the sense that, like, in Canada, for example, we've had a national mental health strategy for almost a decade now. Alhamdulillah, there's a bunch of us that worked very, very hard, a couple really incredible powerhouse alvaizas who are also mental health specialists that worked very hard, and a whole team now that's really supported this. It's a solid policy. It's a solid piece of programming. We've been doing a bunch of stuff across a decade to try and shift how we think about what is mental health, what does mental health stigma look like, what does exclusion look like, particularly when folks are struggling with mental health issues. And we've seen some change, but we've also seen some of the same issues continue to replicate on the ground, right? Of exclusion and challenge and stigma. And so I think, yes, policy change is important. And the way, my sense of the pathway to that is that those of us that have had the benefit and the privilege of becoming well trained in these areas or are knowledgeable or have expertise because we've lived through certain things, because I think lived experience is also very real and valid expertise, that it's up to us then to engage in the institutions and push like hard, because that's how we get change. But I also think that it's also about how do we at a Jamaati level engage folks in these conversations that maybe wouldn't be otherwise. And I think that comes down to like networks and ripples for me. So as I've been thinking around, let's say, conversations around anti-Blackness in the community, I am thinking about like, who do I have in my circle that I can strategically kind of shift or encourage to maybe be more vocal in the ways in which they support Black Lives Matter, or the ways in which they are calling people out when they are saying things that are inherently racist, and how those small ripples eventually end up changing a large scale thing, right? So I think that's part of it. And the other part is, yeah, programs and policy. And my experience in Canada has been, yeah, like at this point, there's a whole slew of us who specialize in mental health. There aren't a ton of us that do particularly what I or Gulnar or Noreen do, which is like this weird intersection of like, I'm an Alwaza and I also do mental health and I also do activism. Like there are like, the fact that there are 3 of us on this blows my mind every day. Like, this is great. Like, look at us doing this, right? And I think that's how you change institutions. You change institutions by having people who have done the work, who can show up and push. And so I think that that's really, really important. And also recognizing, I say this with love, okay? This is my Jamaat and I love you all, but all of us come with baggage. Yes. And that's equally true of our institutional leaders, of our Muki Kamriya, of our Vaizin, of every person in the Jamaat at any level, regardless. Okay, so when we come to our positions with our baggage, that influences the work that we do. And how am I, as someone working towards practicing Rahma, making space for my Muki Sahib, who has like literally watched me grow up, figure out these pieces that maybe he's never had to be exposed to, right? Or my mother, who I love dearly, and how have I watched her and held space for her as she's learned and unlearned with me as I've been doing it, right? And what does that look like? Or how do I make space for, my grandparents are gone now, but my husband still has one grandmother who's alive, and what does it mean to watch the family work through challenging, let's say, anti-Blackness there, right? Like, that's a real thing, and we have to allow for that in a way that is coming from a place of love, because I love this Jamaat and I want it to be better. I want us to be better because I love you. And that, I think, is at the heart of how we move institutions. I think when we spend time pushing in this conflicted way, sometimes it comes from a place of pain and frustration and trauma, and that is real and valid. And we still have to do the work of, I see you and I hear you and I want this for us because this is what I believe we need to do. And so holding that tension is hard work, and it's not fast or easy work. And I think that's the other piece, is sometimes I think, I know we want change immediately, and there is harm that happens that is real and it has to stop. And still, people take time. And so how do we make space for both of those truths at the same time? And I don't think there's an easy answer to that.
Absolutely.
I feel like I'm going to be echoing both Gulnar and Salima. I think something that I like to add is this kind of concept that Salima's touched upon, is this notion of authenticity and how do we find our most authentic self. In part, what happens is that when we're born in a particular family, when we live in a particular country, one of the things that we've learned from Salima is that the context of the US is different. We have a different way that we're navigating these questions and that we're navigating these topics. So one of the things that I noticed was that we tend not to be as holistic about mental health. We tend to focus more on it in terms of a medical model. We tend to talk about trauma as a pathology. And so part of what we were doing today is trying to say, hey, this isn't a siloed thing. This isn't a separate topic. It is holistic and it is part of all of it. You know, some of the questions that of course everyone asks is, wait, social justice in Islam, and you're talking about mental health and trauma, how does that fit? And Gulnar did a beautiful job of answering that. But that reminder is that our culture shapes the way that we move as individuals. And so we have to ask ourselves, how do we participate in changing culture? And the first thing we do is by reflecting on it. And that means that we have to both be in our culture and step outside of our culture and look at it from like that balcony. So one of the analogies that people talk about is when you're on the dance floor and you're moving, you're just moving. You know, you're in the dance. But every so often it's important for us to step outside of the dance floor and look down and ask ourselves, are we moving in the way that we want to? And that's going to be the same for the institutions. Because when we act in these, in a firefighting mode, which oftentimes I find happens when we don't have time or when there's external pressures or there's fear, which I think is a huge component to be talking about. We find ourselves limiting options and avenues. And so one of the ways that we can create institutional change is by moving the dialogue away from individuals not being enough. Because oftentimes we say, this isn't enough, you aren't good enough, you don't get it, you don't understand. And all that does is really refeed into that, to that trauma response of push away. And now it becomes a fight or flight. And it isn't us striking together, it's now kind of an infliction. One of the people that I work really closely with always talks about conflict as striking together. And one of the ways that we move together as a community is to have conflict together. It's to have disagreement. Some of the things that you guys didn't get to see in this call is how Gulnar, Salima, and I navigated our own conversations and our own new views, and we've come to this perspective together. So yes, there is a lot of commonality, but the commonality didn't start when we first met. The commonality actually happened as we were in relation with each other and as we felt comfortable to speak up. And the speak up wasn't an attack, it wasn't an infliction. It was conflict, and it was healthy conflict. And healthy conflicts means speaking up. It also means addressing fear. And I think that's the piece that we have to ask ourselves is that Salima's talked about it, Gulnar's talked about it. We have a narrative of fear. And when there's a narrative of fear that we exist in, whether it's an institution, whether it's an individual, whether it's a community, and I say this as someone who grew up in Saudi Arabia. And so I had a lot of fear about the way that I practiced my faith. I learned to conform. I learned to make sense of, like translate my religion in the Christian language or in the Sunni context or whatever, because for me, it became survival. And so I found myself having to say, okay, in order to survive, I mean, like, because that was, the fear was taught to me by my parents. I had to learn, how do I navigate? And now we have to step back and say, can we move outside of surviving? Can we say that now we want to flourish and that we want to co-create? And so we're going to co-create when we start to talk about these things, when we start to say, when we notice that people are getting defensive, instead of being like, you're getting defensive, you don't get it, which is really the temptation. Or why don't you get it yet? You should know this. I mean, one of the things about our history is that our history shows that we are not unique. Islamic history is full of us doing this work. And so it's very easy to say, well, our history is full of this. Why aren't we doing it? What gets missed is the fact that, hey, what's getting in our way? What are we afraid of? Because as we speak to the fear, we're going to move towards healing. And one of the biggest things that we talk about with social justice is repair, because there is rupture. And the impact of rupture cannot be minimized, but the possibility and the potential for repair also cannot be minimized. And so when we talk about restorative justice aspects, when we think about learning, when we think about these topics that we have all these opinions about, and we step back and say, where did those opinions begin? Let's mine our history. Let's mine our understanding. It allows there to be repair, because I don't want to minimize or invalidate the rupture or the pain. I mean, that's why we began with speaking about what indigenous land we're on, because we have to acknowledge. And that's the first step, I think, the institutions as individuals, because we are the institution collectively. But as individuals, the first thing we have to do is acknowledge impact, to acknowledge that there's been a rupture and then move towards repair. And so each one of us in a community that has a rotation of leaders, because right now we might be sitting on one side of the bot, and tomorrow we'll be sitting on the other. That is the strength of our community, that we rotate our leadership. That as we have these opportunities to lead, whether it's as, you know, a junior volunteer, whether it's in Scouts, whether it's in council, or it's sitting on bot, or whether it's as a WISA for those of us in this group right now, we have to find a way to lead within that, because all of us are leaders in our own right.
I just want to sort of go back to one point that Noreen said, which is really, really important and key, and that's about, you know, speaking up, and the way in which we speak up. But also, I think that the most important element of that is about creating space. Are we creating the space to have these conversations, right? And so for me, working with marginalized communities, it comes down to silencing or erasure or censorship, and so we really have to check that impulse, that just because we're hearing something that makes us uncomfortable or makes us feel judged, and even though there may be some judgment coming externally, but also it could be projection or interjection, right? That we are judging ourselves, and that's making us feel uncomfortable. You know, learning to sit with that discomfort. And that's why I always go back to that piece around, you know, beginning with acceptance. Let's just begin from a place of acceptance and accept that, you know, yes, we are flawed. Nothing is perfect. What are institutions? Institutions are people. They're made up of people. And so by default, they're going to be flawed. There's never going to be a perfect institution, but it can always strive to be better. It can always strive to be more equitable, to be more just, to be more social justice oriented, to be more compassionate, to be more beneficiary informed. Because why do these institutions exist? They exist to serve the community. They exist to, in this case, they exist to serve the Jamaat. And so if we then start from a place of acceptance, it makes it easier to look in the mirror and say, oh, yeah, you know, like there's something wrong there and there's something wrong there, but then move to an approach that in the work that I do is called a strengths-based approach, or an asset building approach. Like begin looking at the things that we're really good at and how can those be leveraged to improve the rest of the stuff that we do, that, you know, and to make that better. And so a key part of that is creating space for people to express what they're feeling without taking it, without feeling sort of insecure and saying like, oh, there's going to be an uprising and they're going to burn it all down, because that's not what it's coming from. That pain and that rage and that angst is people just feeling hurt and expressing their hurt. And once you get to express it, and once you feel like you've been seen and it's validated and it's affirmed and no longer dismissed or shoved away into a dark corner somewhere, then you can move forward with that restorative piece. And how do we move forward to do the repair to the rupture and the hurt? And that's where we really should be striving to get to, right? So let's not do the emotional bypassing, and let's not do the word, you know, the silencing and the censoring. Because ultimately, you know, you look back into our history, like Noreen said, we've constantly been doing this work. We have created space for intellectual freedom, for exchange of ideas, even ideas that we may not agree with, or that may be, you know, controversial or radical, but there has always been a space that has been created. And I think that that's really important. The freedom to have thought and freedom to express yourself. That is such a huge key.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Noreen, Gulnar, and Salima, for your wonderful responses and thoughts. I think the Jamaat and myself included have a lot to think about our processes and how we exist holistically. So I really, really appreciate your time and spending this opportunity for us to learn more about this. So thank you so much, speakers. Thank you, audience, for joining us today. Hopefully this is just the start of the critical conversation, and today was such a treat for me, as I hope it was for all that are watching. So thank you again. A couple of announcements before you go. Our panelists have shared some resources with us that we will share in the chat box. So please refer to these resources to learn more, and they've been curated with this theme and concept in mind. So be sure to look at those. Also, please look out for more information on the ITREB USA webpage and social media pages for young adult conversations this week and our next critical conversation. Please take the survey at the end of the session that will pop out on your screen as you leave. Thank you, and Yali Madad.